Baby blue, your black and white needs a little bit of red. Today I want to experiment a little bit with shades and hues. There's three key aspects to each individual color: lightness, hue, and saturation. Lightness has to do with how much light there is, which can be presented by a black to white gradient. Hue just means what color you're using, and switching between hues can be shown as a gradient. Lastly, there's saturation, how much color there is regardless of lightness. What I'm planning on doing today is to overlap these two at about the same saturation and see if we can't get a color change blend that goes from blue shadows to purple highlights seamlessly. To set up my palette for this, I'm only adding 4 colors to it: black, white, blue red shade, and violet. Before that though, I set up 8 pools of thinner. In each of the pools I create the mixes, kind of like how I had them in the graphic. For black and white, I'm starting with the black only and a bit of white, and white with only a bit of black. Then make a couple steps in between for the other pools. For the blue and purple, I'm doing the same thing, though just straight blue and purple on the left and right. Then 2 steps in between, one with more blue than purple and the other with more purple than blue. Then the fun part, combining each puddle with the one above it to get our desaturated gradient from blue to purple. When it comes to painting with it, I'm starting with the lighter of the more blue shades. I want the armor for this guy to appear more purple than blue, so the dark blue is only going to be there for the really deep shades, edges that get no light at all. He was base coated with a black and just a bit of white, so it's very dark gray. The blue goes over that quite smoothly, though I'm also careful not to paint the deep recesses either. I want to keep those dark, because I'm going to go for a strong contrast with this one. While it does cover quite smoothly the first pass, there are some spots I fortify with a bit more once dried. Once the blue was set, I started going over it with the first purple shade. Because I desaturated it with the gray and added a bit of the blue, it actually layers quite easily over the blue. It dries in the right hue, making it purple, but not too much brighter than the blue. I'm also very generous with the coverage of this one. I want it to be violet in every place that catches the light, and since my habit is to make the light come from the top right of the model, anything that I can see when looking at the model from that direction is getting some of this purple. Though I do keep it thin to allow it to blend with the blue underneath as it tapers off. I started to add more of the next level of purple, but I felt it wasn't different enough from the previous layer. It just wasn't as bright. And it was probably my gray mixes that were too close to each other, so I added a bit more white. Just a tiny bit though, and it got me closer to what I was expecting. With this I filled out the highlights. On the curved cylinder of the boot, the reflection line would run down it, so I start with that along the rim and also do the same against the heel. As I add these highlights, I'm using the very tip of the brush to paint thin lines, parallel with the rim of the boot. Then I follow the overall highlight line down, keeping the lines parallel with the long highlight edges of each part. For the finish, I add a bit more white to the last mix and make it my brightest light. This one's for the very edges of the flat parts, or just the tip if they're really thin. But for the cylinders, I want to follow the parallels I've already made, however, just within a tighter area. That way the highlight goes down the side towards the ground still, but my brush strokes follow the pattern of the rim. I feel at this point I can push the contrast a tiny bit further and add a bit more white and dot the very tips of the sharp edges, and add a few scratches here and there for a bit more texture. For his tactical pouches, I want to go with a brown, but I also want it to come from purple, so I'm going to apply the same color mixing technique, but show a different way to do it. This time only 4 pools of thinner, and I'll start with my color mixes. Starting with the purple, once I'm done mixing the first one, without washing my brush I move it to the next one, and then again, and then again. Each time the purple becoming more dilute in the thinner. Then starting on the other side with the brown, I do the same again, each time the brown getting thinner and thinner in pigment density. Now if you just wanted to blend between two colors, this would be a perfect 4 mixes to layer between. But since I just wanted to do the shading and highlighting with them too, I add black and white to taste to each mix. When it comes to painting, since these aren't large flat surfaces, I start with my dark color. Though as I paint, I do it in a downward motion so that I leave the undersides of the pouch flaps and rims dark. For my next color up, because it's similar to the last one, I don't worry too much about blending, only where it goes, leaving the sides of the pouches alone with it, save for a few edges, and leaving a bit of the middle with the last color I did. For the next color up, this is where I start to texture, using my brush to poke and dab along the edges of the pouches, just getting a base for that texture. Then the last color, I felt it wasn't brown enough as I was seeing on the palette. Things change as you paint, as paints look different dry than they do when wet, so you can't be shy about fixing them on the fly. With my final layer, I added pokes and texture still, just a bit more sparingly than the last one. Once it was dry and finished, I felt some of the color was missing. It was a bit too desaturated. So with a thin layer of the purple and brown mix, I added a single flat layer over top. So the textures should still show, but with a bit more saturation. The blue and purple and the violet and brown I picked were pretty close in hue, not a huge stretch for a transition, but the same process can be done with colors further apart. As an example, this Minotaur I did a while ago, I did red and blue transition between the plates. Because this guy is a commission though, I don't want to get too wild with the color wheel, but let's try something a bit harder. Green to yellow feels like a tough transition, since greens, especially phthalo greens, have a high tinting strength. They take over whatever's mixed into them, but yellows have a low tinting strength. So for these mixes, I really had to control how much green went into each one as I placed the different yellow stages on my palette. The plan is to use this on the mask, and I went with green as the shade so it can stand out along the edges, versus a blue or purple again. I'm starting with my second darkest color again. For the most part, I want this to be yellow, but with a bit of a green halo. So once my first layer is on top, I take a step down, but actually wet blend it along the edges with just a loaded brush, so never at any point will we get the pure green. Then starts the layering. Moving up one more step, I apply the yellow with just a tiny bit of green now. Though because yellow's so see-through, I'm gonna have to take this slow and make sure every layer dries in between. I also start to construct the highlight layers with this mid-yellow. Splitting the screen down the middle, I'm making an upside down half dome on each side, but the dome on the side with my light source will be a bit larger than the one on the opposite side. When I get to my pure yellow layer, you can see how those shapes come together a bit more clearly. The final yellow I'm using is a yellow that already has a white pigment in it, so it just saved me from having to do it myself. Starting with just the highlighting on the edge, I put that in, but take it more carefully for the rounded part of the visor, blocking out my shape, but also washing my brush and using the dry flat bristles to make sure I blend it out fully. Now the yellow feels a bit too desaturated again with that yellow-white, so I take my mid-color, thinned, and add a bit more color back in. To give the visor a bit of purpose, I added some white to the last mix of yellow and painted a little reticle over the visor, just to give it a bit of that sci-fi feel. But the rest was metallics and painted them off camera. I think the overall model ended up a bit dark compared to the concept art I was given, but those dark shades really let the light sources stand out. And while the hue shifts from blue to purple don't scream out their presence, they are subtly there, giving that overall impression instead. There's nothing in the painting rulebook that says that your shades have to be the same as your base or highlight colors, so play with those colors a bit. If you use the 3-step method that's quite common, where you base and then shade and then highlight, switch out one of your shades or highlights for a different hue completely, and see what amazing things you can do when you play with colors. Thanks for joining me on this adventure, and I'll see you on the next journey.